The first time I saw Ruth Calloway, she was arguing with the ground. Not metaphorically, not in that poetic way people say a farmer is in conversation with the land. I mean she was crouched down in the southwest corner of her east pasture, both knees in the dirt, and she was talking to it. Low, flat voice. The kind of voice you'd use if you wanted someone to hear you but didn't want to give them the satisfaction of knowing how much it cost you to speak. "You were here before me," she was saying. "You'll be here after. I'm not asking for a miracle. I'm asking for one more season." I stopped walking. I was maybe 30 yards from her. The light was wrong, late afternoon, everything orange and sideways, the kind of light that makes the New Mexico desert look like it's on fire even when it isn't, and for a moment I couldn't tell if she knew I was there. She did. "You the journalist?" she said, still looking at the ground. "Yes, ma'am." "You going to write something that makes people feel sorry for me?" "I'm going to write what I see." She stood up then, knees cracking, one hand braced on her thigh. She was 63, small in the way of a person who has been compressed by labor rather than diminished by age. Her face was a map of the kind of life that doesn't get written about in magazines: deep lines, sun-darkened skin, eyes that were still sharp even when the rest of her looked exhausted. She was wearing a faded blue work shirt with a torn pocket, and she had the hands of someone who hadn't stopped moving since the day she was old enough to hold a tool. She looked at me, then at my notebook. "You gonna need more than one of those," she said, and walked back toward the house. I'd read the intake files before I came out. Drought had hit the Magdalena area hard 3 seasons running. Ruth Calloway's operation, a mixed-use family farm with grazing pasture, vegetable plots, and a small heritage wheat field that her grandmother had started in 1952, had been bleeding money since 2017. She'd sold off 20 head of cattle in 2018. She'd taken a second mortgage in January 2019. She'd applied for 3 different federal assistance programs and been approved for one, a small emergency loan that covered maybe a third of what she'd lost in the previous harvest. The wheat field was the problem. It was always the wheat. Her grandmother, Elena Reyes Calloway, had planted that field with a specific heritage variety, a drought-tolerant, old-world wheat called Red Fife that her own mother had brought from New Mexico's highlands, seed by seed, in a cloth pouch sewn into the hem of her coat. The field had never been treated with commercial pesticides, never seeded with GMO stock, never rested under plastic mulch or fed with synthetic fertilizers. For 67 years, the field had been managed the way Elena managed everything, carefully, patiently, with a faith in the land that was more practical than mystical. The drought had taken it down to almost nothing. In September 2019, when I arrived, the wheat field was 12 acres of ghost crop. Thin, pale stalks that had struggled to knee height before giving up. The soil was cracked and ashy gray at the surface. When you walked through it, the stalks whispered against your jeans and fell apart at the touch. 3/4 of the seeds hadn't germinated, the ones that had produced heads so small and hollow they barely registered on a scale. Ruth had a buyer for the land. She'd had one for 2 months. A development company out of Albuquerque, polite letters, reasonable offers, patient in the way of people who know time is on their side. She hadn't signed. Every day she didn't sign, the mortgage bled a little more. Her daughter, Cassie, called from Phoenix every Sunday and tried not to say the word sell directly, the way you try not to say the name of something you're afraid of. I know this because Ruth told me, sitting at the kitchen table on that first evening, with a cup of coffee I didn't deserve, and a map of the property spread between us. She didn't offer the information as a confession. She offered it the way a person lays out tools before a repair, methodically, without drama, because the problem needed to be seen whole before it could be addressed. 12 acres, she said, pointing. My grandmother planted it, my mother tended it. I've run it since 1989. 30 years. 30 years, she folded her hands around the coffee cup. I've seen drought before. Seen hail take a crop in 40 minutes. Seen aphids do more damage in a week than drought does in a month. But this is different. Different how? She thought about it. She was the kind of person who thought before speaking, which I'd come to understand was a disappearing habit. Most people I interviewed spoke first and organized later, the way someone shuffles cards after the game is already over. The soil's different, she said finally. It's not just dry, it smells different, tastes different. I must have looked at her strangely because she almost smiled. You've never tasted soil. Can't say I have. Then you don't know what I mean. She stood up, moved to the window, looked out at the dark field. Good soil tastes alive, like something fermented, something working. Like bread before it's baked. She paused. My grandmother's field tastes like nothing, like chalk, like something that's been erased. I started my field log entry that night in the narrow bed in Ruth's spare room, which smelled like cedar and old quilts and the particular dryness of high desert air. I wrote down the phrase she'd used, tastes like something that's been erased. I underlined it. I wrote beside it, pay attention to the soil. I didn't know then that the soil was exactly where this story was going to live. Over the next week, I followed Ruth through her days. She woke at 5, fed the remaining cattle, 11 head, a mix of heritage breed Hereford and Longhorn Cross that she'd kept because they were her grandmother's line, and she wasn't ready to let them go. She walked the fence line. She checked water levels in the stock tanks. She drove the old Ford pickup along the field edge at slow speed, looking at her wheat the way a doctor looks at a patient they're not sure how to help, with a clinical hope that covers a deeper fear. She had a habit of touching things. Fence posts, gate latches, the corner of the barn door, not nervously, not compulsively, more like taking inventory. Like confirming the world was still solid. I noticed it on day 2 and wrote it down. Ruth touches everything she passes, like she's counting what's still here. On day 4, she got a call from a woman named Dr. Priya Mehta. I heard one side of the conversation from the porch, where I was writing. Ruth's voice changed when she answered. It got careful, slower, the way a person's voice changes when they're trying to hold something fragile. Yes, the same field, I heard her say. Yes, the whole 12 acres. A pause. How long would it take? Another pause, longer. And you'd need access starting when? She came out to the porch after she hung up. She stood with her arms crossed, looking at the field. The afternoon light was different from the first day, cloudier, the shadows softer, the dried wheat stalks less silver and more gray. Scientists, she said without me asking, from the University of New Mexico. They've been tracking heritage soil microbiome data across the Southwest for 3 years. They want to sample my field. Why yours? Because, she said, and her voice had something in it I hadn't heard before, not exactly hope, but the door to hope barely cracked. It's the only field in their survey zone that's never been treated. Ever. 67 years of completely untouched soil chemistry. She looked at me, I looked at her. What do they think they'll find? I asked. She wouldn't say exactly. Ruth unfolded her arms, put one hand on the porch railing, touching it, confirming it. She said it might be nothing. She said 3 times it might be nothing. But she drove 6 hours to get here by Saturday. Ruth went back inside. People who think they're going to find nothing don't drive 6 hours. Dr. Priya Mehta arrived on a Saturday morning in a university truck loaded with equipment I couldn't name. Cylindrical sample collectors, temperature probes, sealed containers of some kind of culture medium. A portable field laboratory that took 2 people to carry and set up on the tailgate of her truck. She was accompanied by a graduate student named Tom Birchall, who looked about 24 and had the specific energy of someone who has been awake too long on the best discovery of their life and is trying to remain professionally calm about it. He was failing. It's remarkable, he said, too loudly, standing at the edge of the wheat field with one boot resting on the cracked soil. I mean, statistically, the probability that this level of microbiome integrity exists in a working agricultural field in 2019 is. Tom, Dr. Mehta said. Right, sorry. I liked Tom immediately. I wrote, grad student. Too excited to be careful, probably right about everything. Dr. Mehta was different, composed in the way of someone who has learned to hold their reactions until they've confirmed them. She was in her early 40s, with short-cropped hair and reading glasses she wore on top of her head even when she wasn't reading. She moved through the field slowly, deliberately, and she had the same touching habit as Ruth. She kept crouching to press her palm flat against the dry soil, then lifting it and looking at it like it had said something. I watched Ruth watch her do this. Something passed across Ruth's face. Recognition, maybe, or the particular solidarity of people who understand the same language without having been formally introduced. Tell me about your grandmother's practices, Dr. Mehta said, walking beside Ruth along the western edge of the field. Ruth told her. All of it, the seed pouch, the no-treatment policy, the specific rotation her grandmother had used before rotations were a term anyone applied to heritage farming. She told her about the years her grandmother had scattered dried juniper branches at the field's borders, an old practice she'd learned from a Dene woman named Celestina who'd worked the land beside her in the 1950s. She told her about the one time in 1978 when a county agricultural advisor had urged her mother to apply commercial fertilizer, and how her mother had politely shown the man off the property. Dr. Maida listened, took notes, didn't interrupt. Tom beside me was vibrating slightly. "What is it?" I asked him quietly. "What do you think is down there?" He glanced at Dr. Maida, who was far enough away, looked back at me. "You know about mycorrhizal networks," he said. "Broadly, fungal root systems. They connect plants underground, share nutrients, pass chemical signals, act like a kind of immune system for the soil community." He lowered his voice further, though the wind was already carrying it away. "In most agricultural fields, they're devastated. Tilling, pesticides, monoculture, they fragment the network until it's basically non-functional. But in fields that have never been treated," he stopped himself. "I'm getting ahead of the data." "What does your gut say?" He looked at the field, the pale, failing wheat, the cracked, ashy-gray soil that Ruth said tasted like something erased. "My gut says," he said slowly, "that there might be something alive down there that we haven't seen in a long time." The first samples came back wrong. Not wrong as in contaminated or inconclusive, wrong as in impossible, by the standards of what they'd expected to find in drought-stressed agricultural soil. Dr. Maida ran the preliminary numbers twice on the portable equipment before calling her lab in Albuquerque. I was sitting on the tailgate of my own truck, writing up field notes, when I heard her voice change in the same way Ruth's had changed on the phone, careful, controlled, carrying something fragile. She came to find Ruth, who was in the barn. I followed at a distance that I told myself was professional courtesy, and that was probably something else. "The microbial density in your substrate," Dr. Maida said, standing in the barn doorway with a tablet in her hand, "is not consistent with what we'd expect from a field in this drought state. The surface layer is essentially dead, you can see that, you know that, but at depth 12 to 18 inches, the microbial community is," she paused, chose the word carefully, "intact." Ruth was quiet. "More than intact," Dr. Maida continued. "We're seeing species concentrations that I don't have a field comparison for. There are fungal signatures in this soil that our database associates with old-growth forest ecosystems, not agricultural land, not disturbed land. Old growth." She tapped the tablet. "This soil, Ruth, at depth, may be functioning as an ecological repository. It may have preserved a microbial community that has been lost from essentially every other agricultural site in the region." The barn was quiet except for one of the Herefords shifting her weight, the straw rustling under her hooves. "What does that mean for the wheat?" Ruth asked. It was such a Ruth question. Not what does that mean for science, or what does that mean for me, or what does that mean for anything beyond the immediate and practical. What does that mean for the wheat? Dr. Maida looked at her for a moment. "Possibly everything," she said. "Possibly nothing. I need more time." That night, Ruth sat at the kitchen table after dinner and didn't talk for a long time. I sat across from her with my notebook open and my pen not moving, which was a first for me. Sometimes the right thing to do with silence is leave it alone. She had the mortgage papers on the table in front of her. She hadn't moved them. She wasn't looking at them exactly. It was more like she was aware of them the way you're aware of something standing in your peripheral vision. "My grandmother used to say," she said finally, "that a field remembers what you give it." She smoothed the edge of the mortgage papers with her thumb, not reading them, just touching. I always thought that was a nice thing to say to a child, the way adults say things that sound like wisdom but are really just comfort. She looked up at me. Maybe she was describing something true. Outside, the desert was cooling fast the way it does 30-degree swing from afternoon to midnight, the stars coming out with the aggressive clarity they have at altitude. I could hear the wind moving through the dying wheat field, that soft collapse of stalks that never quite becomes music but tries. I wrote one line in my log that night. The field remembers. The question is whether memory is enough. On day 9, the development company called. Ruth put the phone on the counter and let it ring 4 times before she answered. She told them she needed 2 more weeks. The voice on the phone, I could hear the tinny politeness of it from across the kitchen, told her the offer wouldn't hold indefinitely. "I understand," she said, and hung up. She stood at the counter for a moment, her back to me, her hands still on the phone. Then she walked out the back door toward the field, and I gave her 10 minutes alone before I followed. She was in the wheat again, down on her knees, both hands flat against the soil, not talking this time. Just listening. I wrote it down. I write everything down. But some things you write down because you know you'll never be able to carry them in your memory properly. Because they're too quiet, too specific, too much about the quality of light on a dying field, and the shape of a woman who is holding on to something she cannot afford to lose. By the second week, the field had become something different. Not visibly, the wheat still stood pale and thin, still sighed apart at a touch, still crumbled into that dry ash smell that had started to feel like the defining scent of the whole property. But it had become a field that people were paying attention to in a way that changed the air around it. Science does that. The moment you begin measuring something closely, the thing being measured takes on a different gravity, like a photograph that starts to mean more once you understand what was about to happen to the people in it. Dr. Maida had brought 2 more graduate students by the end of the first week. Tom Birchall had barely slept. He had that specific hollow-eyed alertness of someone running on discovery rather than rest, the way you sometimes see in people who are inside a moment they will spend the rest of their lives explaining to others. The graduate students moved through the field at dawn and dusk with their collection equipment, careful and deliberate, extracting soil cores at measured intervals, and sealing them in the kind of containers that looked medical, sterile, too clean for the dusty business of the desert. Ruth watched them, mostly from a distance. She didn't interfere. She answered questions when asked, precise, factual answers delivered in that flat, practical voice, but she didn't hover, didn't demand updates, didn't ask for reassurance. I think she understood, in some wordless way, that the work required stillness from her even when everything inside her was the opposite of still. I watched her watching them. That's a thing about journalism, you're always one step removed from the event, observing the observer, trying to capture the gap between what's happening and what it means. Some journalists find that distance comfortable. I've always found it slightly painful. You're never quite inside the story. You're always standing at the edge, notebook open, pen moving, writing down things that belong to someone else. On day 11, I did something I probably shouldn't have. I brought Ruth a cup of coffee out to the field edge, where she was standing in the early morning watching the graduate students work, and I asked her about the decision she hadn't made yet. "You're still not signing," I said. It wasn't quite a question. "No. How much longer can you wait?" She took the coffee, held it in both hands the way she always held things, firmly, like she was taking a reading. "The offer expires in 9 days. The loan payment after that will take whatever I have left in reserves." She paused. "After that, the bank starts the formal process." "Do you know what you're waiting for?" She looked at me. In the low morning light, her eyes were very dark, very steady. "No," she said, "I don't know what I'm waiting for. I just know I'm not done yet." There's a thing people say about farmers, a kind of sentimental statement that gets recycled in agricultural journalism until it's lost any real meaning. They have a relationship with the land that goes beyond business. It's true, but the way it's usually said makes it sound like a personality trait, like something inherited from the idea of farming rather than from the practice of it. What it actually looks like up close is something more uncomfortable than that. It looks like a person making a choice that doesn't make rational sense, over and over, because the alternative feels like a betrayal they can't fully articulate. It looks like Ruth Calloway standing in the cold morning air in a field that everyone else has already written off, holding her coffee with both hands, saying she doesn't know what she's waiting for. The discovery, when it came, arrived the way significant things usually do, not in the form of a dramatic announcement, but as a small accumulation of evidence that kept refusing to be dismissed. Dr. Maida had sent the most complex samples to 2 external labs, one at New Mexico State, one at Arizona State, and requested expedited processing, which in academic timelines meant approximately a week rather than the usual 3. While she waited, she ran secondary analysis on the samples she could process locally, mapping the microbial community structure at different soil depths, charting the relationships between fungal hyphae networks, bacterial colonies, and the root systems of the barely surviving wheat. On day 12, she came to the kitchen where Ruth and I were eating a late lunch. Canned soup, bread Ruth had baked that morning, the domestic simplicity of a house that was running on reduced resources but hadn't stopped making things. And she put her tablet on the table with a look on her face that I had not seen from her before. Not composed, not careful. Wondering. "I need to show you something," she said to Ruth. She sat down and turned the tablet so we could both see it. On the screen was a rendered image, a three-dimensional mapping of soil structure, rendered in false color to show density and activity. At the surface, the image was gray and fractured, like a satellite view of a dried riverbed. But at depth, beginning roughly 10 inches down and extending to about 22 inches, the image blazed. Deep orange and red, indicating microbial activity, threaded through with intricate white filaments. The fungal network, that spread laterally in patterns so dense and interconnected they looked almost architectural. "This," Dr. Mehta said, pointing to the white network, "is a mycorrhizal community, but not the species we'd expect, not even close." She zoomed in on a section. "What we're seeing here, and I want to be careful about how I say this, because the external labs haven't confirmed yet, appears to be a strain of glomus-related fungi that our current database has only associated with undisturbed grassland ecosystems from the pre-Columbian period." Ruth looked at the image, then at Dr. Mehta. "Meaning," Dr. Mehta said quietly, "that what is alive in this soil may have been alive in this soil for centuries. And what you and your grandmother and your great-grandmother did by never treating this field, never disrupting the surface at depth, never introducing synthetic chemistry, you may have been the only thing standing between that community and extinction." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the graduate students were working in the field, their voices carrying occasionally on the wind, too distant to make out words. "My grandmother," Ruth said finally, "would say she wasn't preserving anything. She'd say she was just being careful." "Yes," said Dr. Mehta, "I think that's exactly right. There's a thing that happens in stories like this. I've covered enough of them to recognize the pattern, where the scientific discovery resolves the emotional problem neatly. The ecosystem is found, the land is saved, the family farm gets to continue, and everyone learns something beautiful about the relationship between humans and nature. The journalist writes a warm piece that gets shared on social media, and the farm becomes the subject of a minor documentary. I want to be honest with you, that is not what was happening. Because the discovery, extraordinary as it was, didn't change the mortgage, didn't change the 9-day deadline, didn't change the development company's offer or the bank's timeline. Academic interest in a soil microbiome, even a genuinely remarkable one, doesn't have an immediate cash value. Dr. Mehta could document everything she was finding, and it would still take months, possibly years, before any of it translated into funding, into protection, into the kind of institutional support that could actually keep a farm solvent. And Ruth knew this. She'd known it from the moment Dr. Mehta first called. She was not a woman who confused hope for solution. What I watched over the next 3 days was something more complicated and more honest than a story where science saves the day. I watched a woman decide in real time what she was fighting for. Cassie Calloway drove up from Phoenix on day 14. She arrived at noon in a silver sedan that looked out of place on the dirt road, the way everything from a city looks slightly wrong in the desert, too reflective, too smooth, too unweathered. She was in her mid-30s, dark-haired like her mother, with Ruth's quality of deliberateness overlaid with the specific tension of someone who has been worrying at a distance for a long time. She hugged Ruth in the yard for a long moment. I was at the fence line with my notebook, and I looked away, the way you do when something belongs to people that you don't have a right to observe. Dinner that night was different from the others. There were 4 of us, Ruth, Cassie, Dr. Mehta, and me, and the conversation moved around the central subject the way conversations do when the central subject is too large to approach directly. We talked about the soil data. We talked about which external lab had the faster processing time. Dr. Mehta explained, patiently and precisely, what she thought the findings could mean in terms of academic publication, potential conservation status, the possibility of grant funding from organizations that supported heritage ecosystem preservation. Cassie listened carefully. She had a legal notepad in front of her and she wrote things down, numbers, timelines, names of organizations Dr. Maida mentioned. She was doing what she could do, which was organize, prepare, find the paths that existed in the practical world. Then she put the pen down. "Mom," she said. Ruth looked at her. "If the grants take a year to come through," Cassie said, with the careful, measured tone of someone who has rehearsed this, "we'd need to find another way to keep the mortgage current in the meantime. I've been looking at options. There's a land conservation easement program through the Nature Conservancy that could provide some interim revenue, but it would restrict what you could do with the—" Cassie stopped. Ruth reached across the table and put her hand over her daughter's, just rested it there. "I know what you've been doing," she said. "The research you've been doing, all those Sunday calls where you didn't quite say what you were thinking." She looked at her daughter with something that was love, clearly, but also something I found harder to name, something like the specific tenderness of a person looking at someone they've protected for years and recognizing that the protection is no longer needed and might never have been. "You've been carrying this." "You're my mother," Cassie said. "Of course I've been carrying it." "I know," Ruth squeezed her hand. "I need you to know that whatever happens with this land, whatever I decide, whatever the bank decides, whatever Dr. Maida finds, I'm okay. I need you to believe that." "I don't know if I do believe it," Cassie said quietly. "Then that's what I need you to work on," Ruth said. "Not the easements, not the programs, that." Dr. Maida was looking at the table. I was looking at my notebook, not writing. "Some things you don't write down right away. You just let them happen and trust yourself to carry them." The call from Arizona State came on day 15 at 6:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I'd been up since 5, sitting on the porch with my coffee and my log, and I heard Dr. Maida's phone ring in the room she'd been using, and then I heard her voice, that controlled voice, jump one register higher than it normally went. She came out to the porch 20 minutes later. She was still in the oversized university sweatshirt she slept in, her reading glasses on top of her head, her tablet in her hands, and her face had the look of someone who has been given information they haven't fully translated into meaning yet, like a person reading a letter in a language they're mostly fluent in. "It's confirmed," she said. "Both labs." She sat down in the other porch chair and looked at the field. "The fungi in your soil are not just old. They are, as far as we can determine, a continuous living culture with genetic markers that predate European contact in this region by at least 300 years, possibly longer. There's a paper we'll need to write, several papers." She looked at me. "And there will be attention, significant attention. I want you to prepare Ruth for that." "Shouldn't you tell her yourself?" "I will, but you've been here longer. You know how she receives things." I thought about how Ruth had stood in her field and talked to the ground, how she'd told me good soil tastes alive, how she'd said, "I don't know what I'm waiting for, I just know I'm not done yet." "She'll receive it like she receives everything," I said, quietly, "and then she'll ask what it means for the wheat." Dr. Maida almost smiled. "The wheat," she said, "is where it gets genuinely remarkable." The external analysis had detected, in the root zone of the surviving wheat plants, the thin, struggling plants that had managed to germinate despite the drought, evidence of active mycorrhizal colonization. Not historical, not dormant. Active. The ancient fungal network, somehow persisting at depth through 3 seasons of drought, had extended its filaments upward into the failing crop's root system. It wasn't enough to save the harvest that year. But it was, and Dr. Maida used the word carefully, the way she used all words, attempting to. "The network is responding to the wheat's distress signals," she said. "It's trying to transfer phosphorus, to root what water is available at depth upward to the roots. It's doing what it evolved to do over centuries." She paused. "The drought is too severe for this growing season. The crop is too far gone, but the biology is not gone. The system is functional if the drought breaks, even partially, next season with the network intact." She trailed off. "Say it," I said. "I don't want to overstate." "Say what you think." Dr. Maida looked at the field. At the pale wheat catching the first morning light, the stalks still fragile, still half dead, but standing. "I think," she said, "that if this soil is protected, if the field is not developed, not treated, not disrupted, it may be capable of regenerating a wheat crop next season without any intervention at all. I think the network may do it." I think this field, left alone and given one good rainfall, may grow wheat the way it grew wheat for 67 years. She looked at me. I think Ruth's grandmother built something. I think Ruth protected something. And I think what they protected might have just enough left to come back. The morning light moved across the field. The wind picked up slightly, and the wheat stalks trembled with it, that soft, failing music sound. Somewhere in the house, I heard Ruth's alarm go off. 5 o'clock, same as every morning. Start the day, feed what needs feeding. I went inside and told her over coffee, before Dr. Maida came down. Not because it was my place to tell her, it wasn't, but because I'd been watching this woman for 2 weeks and I understood, by then, something about how she was built. She wouldn't want to be told significant news with an audience. She wouldn't want to manage her own reaction in front of multiple people. She would want to hear it simply, plainly, without performance, and then she would want a moment to put it away before she was expected to respond. So I told her, quietly, at the kitchen table, just the facts, what the labs had found, what the network was doing, what Dr. Maida believed was possible. Ruth listened. She held her coffee in both hands. She didn't move. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "The soil remembered." She wasn't asking me to confirm it. She wasn't asking for anything. She said it the way you say something when you've suspected it for a very long time, and have only just been given permission to believe it. The days after the confirmation were the strangest of the 6 weeks I spent in Magdalena. Not because of the science. The science was moving the way science moves, which is to say not dramatically but with a grinding, building momentum, like a river that has broken through a dam and is filling a new channel without quite knowing yet how wide that channel will be. Dr. Maida's calls with colleagues at 2 other universities had begun producing the kind of cautious but accelerating academic interest that shows itself in long emails and requests for raw data and the specific phrase, "I'd like to come see this myself." A soil ecologist from the University of Colorado arrived on day 18. A graduate program director from the University of Arizona arrived the day after, in a car that looked like she'd driven through the night to get there. The field was becoming something different than a dying wheat field. It was becoming a site. But Ruth was still Ruth, still up at 5, still walking the fence line, still touching the gate latch on the way through, confirming the world. She had a conversation with the development company. I wasn't there for it. She made the call from the barn, and when she came back, she didn't say anything for about an hour. Then at dinner, she told Cassie, who had stayed, that she'd asked for a formal extension of 30 days. "Did they give it to you?" Cassie asked. "They gave me 2 weeks. Ruth broke bread and passed it. It's enough." "Enough for what?" Ruth looked at her daughter with that same look from the kitchen. The love and the other thing, the release of something. "Enough to know what we're deciding," she said. "Whether we're deciding to sell a farm or deciding to sell something else." Cassie had the legal notepad again. She'd been in contact with the Nature Conservancy and with a Heritage Land Trust organization based in Santa Fe, working the financial problem from every angle she could reach. She'd also, quietly, talked to 2 agricultural journalists with larger platforms than mine about the story. I didn't take offense. This was the right thing to do, and by day 20, there was a feature in production for a national magazine, and a public radio producer had reached out to Dr. Maida. Money was still the problem. Not enough of it, not fast enough. On day 21, a thing happened that I've never written about until now, because it happened privately and Ruth had to give me specific permission to include it, which she did 2 years later on a phone call where she said, "Write it. It matters. People should know what asking for help actually looks like." She drove to the bank. Not to plead, not to negotiate. She'd made an appointment with the loan officer she'd been dealing with for 3 years, a man named Gary Trujillo, who was, she'd told me earlier in the month, a decent man in a system that doesn't reward decency. She brought the preliminary data that Dr. Maida had given her permission to share, printed pages, field maps, the external lab confirmation, and she laid it on his desk. She also brought something else. She brought a photograph, old, black and white, slightly faded, of her grandmother Alina standing in the wheat field in what looked like the early 1960s. Alina was small in the photograph, not unlike Ruth, wearing a dress and an apron and holding a sheaf of wheat across both arms like it was something ceremonial. She was looking at the camera without quite smiling, with the expression of someone who knows the value of what they're holding but doesn't feel the need to demonstrate it. Ruth put the photograph on the desk beside the lab reports. She said, "I'm not asking you to make a business decision based on sentiment. I'm asking you to look at what I'm showing you and tell me whether 60 additional days is something this institution can extend, given the evidence that this land may have value that we are only beginning to understand." Gary Trujillo looked at the data, looked at the photograph. He was quiet for a while. "Ruth," he said, "I can take this to the board. I can make the case. I cannot promise you what they'll say." "I know," she said. "I'm not asking for a promise." She drove home, told no one, made dinner, fed the cattle, walked the fence. I didn't know any of this had happened until Cassie told me, 3 days later, that the bank had approved a 60-day extension. The Colorado soil ecologist's name was Dr. James Whitehorse, a trim, quiet man in his mid-50s who moved through the field with the deliberate attention of someone who has spent 30 years learning to see what other people walk past. He was Jicarilla Apache, which he mentioned once briefly when Ruth asked him where he was from originally. He said it without emphasis, the way you say something that is true and does not need elaboration. He and Ruth spent a morning together in the field, just the two of them, while the graduate students worked in another section. I watched from distance. I couldn't hear most of what they said, but I could see them, two small figures in a large, pale field, crouching occasionally, touching the soil, standing and talking. At one point, Dr. Whitehorse knelt and pressed both palms flat against the ground, the way Ruth had been doing since before the scientists arrived, and I watched Ruth watch him do it. Something in her posture changed, a slight release across the shoulders, a drop of some held tension, as if she'd been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, to see someone else understand the language. He came and found me later, at the edge of the field. "Do you know what the Apache term is for this kind of soil knowledge?" he asked me. I didn't. He said a phrase in his language that I couldn't spell correctly, told me it translates roughly as the memory of the ground, or, more accurately, what the earth holds that we have asked it to hold. He said that traditional ecological knowledge in many southwestern cultures had understood, long before Western science named it, that undisturbed soil was not just a growing medium, but an archive. That the choices made by the people who worked a piece of ground were encoded in it over time, in the community of living things that either persisted or didn't. What Ruth's grandmother did, he said, looking at the field, was practiced. It wasn't instinct, even if it felt like instinct. Her grandmother learned it from someone, and that someone learned it from someone else. He paused. The science is confirming something that has been understood in different language for a very long time. I wrote that down. I wrote all of it down. I write everything down. But I also just let it sit there in the afternoon air for a while, the way he'd said it, quietly, without making anything of it, trusting the truth to carry itself. On day 26, Tom Birchall came running across the field at a pace that alarmed everyone who saw it. He'd been running a time-lapse moisture analysis on the soil columns he'd been sampling every other day, tracking what was happening in the rhizosphere, the zone of soil directly around the wheat roots. And he'd been building a picture, data point by data point, of whether the mycorrhizal network was doing what Dr. Mehta had hypothesized it was trying to do. He had his laptop open as he ran, which I thought was dangerous, but he was too young to have learned that lesson yet. "The network is routing moisture," he said, getting to Dr. Mehta first, then to Ruth, opening the laptop for them both to see. "Look, the wheat root samples from 4 days ago show 8% soil moisture at the rhizosphere. Today's samples show 11%. In drought conditions, in a field that hasn't had precipitation in 61 days. Dr. Mehta looked at the numbers. "The network is feeding the root zone," Tom said, his voice slightly higher than usual with the effort of containing the implication. "It's pulling moisture from a deeper aquifer table and routing it upward through the fungal filaments. I didn't think it could do this in a field this depleted. The theoretical models suggest the energetic cost would be too high, but it's doing it. The network is paying the cost." Ruth was looking at the laptop screen. She wasn't a scientist. The data meant something to her in shape rather than in number. The upward trend was visible even without understanding the precise units, the way a thermometer tells you temperature before you can read the scale. "Will it save the crop this year?" she asked. Tom looked at Dr. Mehta. This was always the question, and it never quite had the answer anyone wanted. "Not this crop," Dr. Mehta said. "The stalks are already too far gone, the seed heads won't fill." She paused. But this is evidence that the network is not just preserved, it's active, it's responding, and if next spring's moisture conditions are within normal range, she stopped. If I'm still here next spring, Ruth said. It was not a self-pity statement. It was a practical condition. She stated it and then looked at the data as if it were a tool that needed assessment. Then you should plant in October, Dr. Maida said quietly. Exactly the same variety your grandmother used, in exactly the same way. Don't change anything. Let the network do what it does. She looked at Ruth directly. I believe it will. Believe is a strong word from a scientist. Ruth heard it the way it was meant. There was a rain on day 29. Not a significant rain, not the kind that ends a drought, not the kind that farmers pray for on their knees. It was a brief, sideways desert rain, 40 minutes in the late afternoon, that moved through on a dark-bellied cloud that seemed almost surprised to be delivering water. The smell of it, petrichor, that specific scent of rain hitting dry earth, which is actually caused by the soil microbiome releasing compounds called geosmin when moisture arrives, came through the screen door of the kitchen while Ruth and I were sitting with coffee. She smelled it before I did. She was up from the table and out the door in under 5 seconds, moving across the yard toward the field at a pace that wasn't quite a run but was faster than her usual walk, and I grabbed my notebook and followed her. She stood at the edge of the wheat field and turned her face up. The rain was light and warm, and the desert was taking it with that particular greediness of dry land meeting water, drinking it down before it could be measured, the dust jumping with each drop, the pale wheat stalks bending and darkening. It wasn't enough. Everyone standing there knew it wasn't enough. But Ruth was smiling. Not the almost smile I'd seen occasionally, the one she deployed quickly and pulled back before it could commit to full expression. A real smile. Small, upward at the corners, private in the way of something belonging entirely to one person in one moment. She put her hands out to her sides, palms up, and let the rain hit them. Tom, behind me, had his phone out recording data from the moisture sensors. Dr. Whitehorse, at the far side of the field, was standing the same way Ruth was standing, palms up, face toward the sky. The formal grant application was filed by the end of the month. Dr. Maida's paper, co-authored with the Arizona State Lab and Dr. Whitehorse, was submitted to a major journal in November. I know this because she sent me the draft, and I read it 3 times, translating the scientific language into something I could hold. The paper documented what the Callaway field contained: a continuous mycorrhizal network of precontact antiquity, in active functional state, representing the most intact heritage agricultural microbiome documented in the American Southwest. It documented what had preserved it: 67 years of zero synthetic intervention, managed by 3 generations of women who understood, in the language available to them, what they were protecting. The paper also documented something that hadn't been in any of the conversations in the field, something Dr. Maida told me about over the phone in October, 3 weeks after I'd left Magdalena. In the soil at the deepest level, they'd sampled 28 inches. They'd found carbon isotope signatures consistent with deliberate soil-building practices. Not passive non-intervention, active management. The specific way certain organic materials had been layered at depth, the particular ratio of the fungal community in relation to the bacterial colony, the trace minerals present, all of it bore the signature of intentional practice. Someone, long before Alina Reyes Callaway picked up her seed pouch, had built this soil, had chosen this ground and made it into something capable of lasting. We will never know who. That is the part that has stayed with me longest, not the grant, which came through partially in the spring, not the easement agreement that the Nature Conservancy finalized in February, which provided enough annual income to cover the mortgage with a small surplus. Not the magazine feature, or the radio segment, or the small but genuine wave of interest from people who read about a woman who'd held on to her land by not letting go of how it was held. What has stayed with me is the unnamed person, or people, who worked that soil before any record was kept, who understood what they were building without a language for mycorrhizal networks or carbon sequestration or heritage microbiome preservation, who did the right thing, carefully, in the right way, and trusted that the ground would hold what they gave it. Ruth's grandmother held it. Ruth held it. The field, through 3 seasons of drought and a mortgage deadline, and the particular loneliness of making a choice that doesn't make rational sense, had held them back. I left Magdalena on a Thursday morning in late October. Ruth walked me to my truck. The air was cold, properly cold for the first time since I'd arrived, the kind of cold that felt like a door closing on summer and opening on something harder and plainer and more honest. The wheat field was empty, cleared to bare soil after the failed harvest, ready for the October planting Dr. Maida had recommended. From the road, it looked like nothing, just dirt, just a patch of ground no different from any other patch of ground. You wouldn't know to look at it. You drive past it on Route 60 and see desert and a farmhouse and a fence and nothing remarkable. Ruth handed me a small paper bag through the window. Inside was a cloth pouch, not old, not hers. She'd made it, containing a small quantity of red fife wheat seed. "For what?" I asked. "In case you ever have a patch of ground," she said. "I'm a journalist. I live in an apartment." "Then for when you don't," she stepped back from the truck. "You keep your notebooks, keep that too." I'm looking at the pouch right now as I write this. It's sitting on the corner of my desk beside log number 32. I haven't planted it. I tell myself it's because I haven't had the right ground yet. The truth is I don't know how to give something away that carries the weight of what that seed carries. Ruth planted in October. She used her grandmother's method. She changed nothing. In the spring, I know this because she called me in April, brief as always, practical as always. The wheat came up. All 12 acres. She said it the way she would have said the weather, or the cattle numbers, or the state of the stock tanks. She said the field remembered. And then she said she had to go because the fence line needed checking, and she hung up.